Every creator knows the feeling. You sit down in front of an empty page, and the pressure sets in. Society demands that you pull a completely original idea out of thin air. In 1919, the poet T.S. Eliot stepped up and dismantled that myth. He argued that trying to create in a vacuum is a guaranteed path to failure. No artist, he wrote, has their complete meaning alone. He called his theory impersonality. For Eliot, making art meant willfully surrendering your individual ego to the massive weight of history. You don't ignore the dead, you submit to them. To find your own individual talent, you have to let yourself be absorbed by the creative ancestors who came before you. Eliot imagined European literature as an ideal order. Think of it as a simultaneous living museum, where Homer sits in the exact same room as a modern novelist, all existing at once. But if this historical order is already complete, how can anyone write something new? Eliot's answer is that when a truly new work arrives, it forces the entire existing order to readjust. The new node shifts the lines of connection, altering the proportions and values of every single piece of art around it. 3 decades later, the Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges took Eliot's mechanic and pushed it into a temporal loop. Borges looked closely at Franz Kafka. He realized that Kafka's paranoid, bureaucratic style appears in texts written centuries before Kafka was even born. Kafka's voice is so powerful that it retroactively forces us to read older writers in a completely different way. Influence doesn't flow downward from the past in a straight line. A sufficiently strong creator literally invents their own precursors. Eliot and Borges described a relatively polite, harmonious museum. In the 1970s, the literary critic Harold Bloom looked at that same tradition and saw an Oedipal slaughterhouse. Bloom identified the crushing realization that hits every ambitious creator. Your heroes have already written exactly what you want to write. He called this the anxiety of influence. To survive this psychological battlefield, you cannot simply admire your ancestors. What Bloom termed strong poets must wrestle their literary fathers to the death to secure their own existence. The weapon of choice is misprision. A creator intentionally misreads or twists the predecessor's work, aggressively carving out an imaginative space for themselves. Bloom points to Oscar Wilde as a tragic example of a weak talent. Wilde absorbed his influences beautifully, but because he refused to fight them, he ended up as merely an echo of other writers' voices. The paralyzing fear of being unoriginal serves a vital purpose. It forces a strong creator to swerve away from tradition to forge their own identity. Bloom's theory assumes every creator actually has a seat at the table. But what happens if you aren't even invited to the war? Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar looked at Bloom's hyper-masculine framework and found it completely inadequate for women writers of the 18th and 19th centuries. They identified an earlier, deeper barrier, the anxiety of authorship. This was the culturally conditioned fear experienced by women that they lacked the legitimate right to pick up a pen in the first place. Fighting a patriarchal predecessor would be suicidal. Instead, they had to hunt down a secret sisterhood of role models, like Emily Dickinson, to prove that the act of writing was even physically possible for them. For marginalized creators, establishing talent requires resurrecting erased ancestors. They have to piece together a lineage before they can even begin to speak. If we pull back from the psychological anxiety of the individual, we hit the structural reality of language itself, a space mapped out by theorist Julia Kristeva. Kristeva argued for intertextuality. Every single text is a mosaic of quotations. Pure originality is a structural impossibility because the words we use are already infected with the meanings of everyone who spoke them before us. This leaves us with a heavy burden of biological and geographical inheritance, what Edward Said called filiation. But Said also offered a way out. We can consciously curate our ancestors. Said termed this affiliation. We have the ability to deliberately select and weave together the specific cultural threads that build our intellectual lineage. True creation is the courageous act of curating those inherited threads into a bespoke identity. You don't generate ideas from nothing, you synthesize them. We can look again at that initial fear of the blank page. Every empty canvas sits atop a dense, noisy web of the past waiting to be untangled. Tradition, influence, and anxiety provide the essential raw materials of creation. Individual talent is the ability to absorb the immense anxiety of history, misread it on purpose, and force it into the future. That weight of the past provides the very leverage needed to make history.